Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. We're excited that you've joined us. Our topic today is security and DevOps. What we have here is a failure to communicate. Today's webinar is sponsored by Beyond Trust. My name is Mitch Ashley. I'm going to serve both as the host moderator and also one of the presenters. A couple of housekeeping items. Our webinar is being recorded, and all the participants will receive an email that has a link to the recording as well as today's slides. We're also giving away 3 Amazon gift cards, $50 gift cards. So stick around to the end, find out if you happen to be one of the lucky winners. Last but not least, both of our presenters, myself and Jason, who I'll be introducing in a moment, love questions. So we really would appreciate if you'd enter any questions that you have while we're talking into the GoToWebinar control panel, the questions tab, and we'll get to those questions near the end of today's webinar. So let's move on to our topic, security and DevOps. What we have here is a failure to communicate. First, I'll be leading things off, but I also want to introduce our second speaker before we get going. Our second speaker will be Jason Jones. He is Senior Product Manager with Beyond Trust. Say hello, Jason.
Hey, guys.
Okay, you'll get to hear more from Jason here in just a moment. So wonderful. Let's get started. Our topic today. I just want to say a little bit more in introducing myself. In addition to hosting the webinar, I also am the CEO Managing Analyst of the firm called Accelerated Strategies Group. It's an analyst firm. And some of the background that I have is both as a security product CTO running dev organizations, selling to enterprises in the Defense Department, but also on the IT side as a CIO running dev, IT, and also security. So I have the luxury or maybe the curse of living on both sides of this topic, which maybe makes me uniquely qualified to talk about how dev and security can work together. At least I hope so for today's presentation. So a little bit more about Accelerated Strategies Group. We do focus on DevOps, cloud native cybersecurity, have this open source business model, and have a number of people that if you're in the DevOps space, you may recognize some of those folks. So let's move on to our important topic. What we have here is a failure to communicate, security and dev. So I think we sent out with the invite this cartoon, which was developed by actually one of our analysts. I like to think of this failure to communicate idea as sometimes we're talking different languages, whether we're a security engineer or we're a software development professional. So for example, in this cartoon, different words for or phrases, language for how we think about secrets management in a dev environment versus privileged access management is a term we would use more in the security world. So oftentimes, one of the things that we just need to start with is understanding that sometimes we have different language for the same things. Sometimes we just have language we're not necessarily familiar with in each other's environments. Kind of give you some examples here in how we communicate between security engineers and software development professionals. Now, things like code vulnerability scanning. In the software world, we call that software composition analysis. At least that's one term for it. In the security world, we think, of course, the 3 tenets is confidentiality, integrity, availability. In the software world, we're all about getting software out the door. And yes, there's methodologies to what we do, but we focus on kind of build run is that what we think about today in the world of cloud. DevSecOps, SecOps, shift left, those are kind of terms that get thrown around in both of our environments. And of course, as security professionals, we're interested in things like compliance and controls. Whereas in the software world, going back to Mark Andreessen's phrase that he came up with, the software's eating the world. Really, developers have kind of been elevated in their role and their importance and their involvement in creating new business capabilities that help organizations go through a digital transformation and deliver new value. And then we, of course, have all of our own different terms. In the dev world, we think about CI/CD for continuous integration, continuous deployment, pipelines, tool chains, APIs, of course, open source software, very focused on automation, software architectures, containers, service mesh, things like that. And in the security world, we're concerned more about risk management, identity management, things like zero trust model. We're well beyond the days of having trusted and untrusted parts of the network, for example. And with software architectures becoming more porous with things like services and microservices and service mesh, we're getting even into a software or application security model where security professionals and developers really have to start understanding each other's technologies, if you will, to help come up with the best security solutions for their applications. Incident response, trust management, all that kind of stuff, threat management. So a number of terms that we all have to use as part of our professional worlds, but it isn't always clear to each other what we mean by those things. Goes back to our title for today's webinar. What we've got here is a failure to communicate, which goes way back to a movie in the 60s called Cool Hand Luke, where where they were not, but between the captain of the chain gang and Cool Hand Luke, Paul Newman, who was on the chain gang, were having a little communication problem, let's say. I'll leave it to you to check out the movie if you're so inclined. So let's talk about some of the orientations of both kinds of folks, security professionals, software development professionals. And this in part leads to maybe where some of the disconnects is created, but also understanding that is maybe giving us some areas where we can help create connections and help each other create the best and secure software and applications. So if I put my security hat on for a moment, the things that I know that where everybody from the CISO to security engineer, auditors, folks like that, is security people feel a real responsibility for security across the entire organization. They know that if a breach happens or some issue comes up or there's a policy issue or we need to keep up to date, some regulatory issue has changed, all of those things are eventually going to land on their lap if they don't show up there first. So if you have a breach, I want to know, why did we have that problem? It doesn't mean it happened in the security team's organization. It may have, but it also may have happened in an operations setting or how we created software. It may be even something unrelated to all of that. It could be end user device, and something that got compromised. So that's really a very strong mindset, that a huge sense of responsibility that security professionals feel. Of course, there's things like governance, which is a label that gets put on a lot of things, but it's really around deciding what our policies are we following those policies, what are the regulatory and compliance requirements we need to meet, and how do we make sure that we have processes and systems to be able to help the organization meet that. It's not something developers talk a lot about. Of course, I mentioned zero trust, right? That zero trust model is you don't trust anything. Everything is potentially an untrustworthy piece of software, microservice, system, cloud service, third-party application, open source, all kinds of things. So you really try to live in a world where you don't trust any of those, or at least any of them could be compromised or an entry point to get access into your software stack, your data center, your cloud environment, whatever it might be. Also, security engineers think about things like security through obscurity. What we mean by that is we don't necessarily want to disclose everything we do and how we do it for our security architecture, for our policies, for the products, the tools that we use. It just gives the hacker or third party, whoever it might be, a leg up on figuring out how to break into the organization, get it to access to our database, get to the directory or credentials or whatever might give them access to our IP and our data. So oftentimes security folks will be a little bit less, or I guess more close to the vest with information is a phrase we might use, a little bit less open. And that can also come off kind of funny sometimes, where you're not necessarily living in that kind of world. Of course, audits and controls, threat response, privacy of our data, privacy of our customers, all of those kind of things. Now in the software world, especially with DevOps on the scene, cloud native applications, it's really focused around speed. How quickly can we get new functionality, new capabilities that enable current revenue streams, improve customer experience, all kinds of things, entering new markets, whatever it might be, making us more competitive. And so software teams are much more understanding and aware of the demands that are being put upon them, not just to create applications and functionality, but how that's going to turn into revenue or customer satisfaction or other uh, uh, indicators for the business, ways that we measure success of the business. And also, dev teams in a DevOps world are very focused on automation, right? If there's a repetitive task, if there's something we can automate and make the process faster while maintaining quality or improving quality, we want to do that because that helps us get deploys out into production sooner, quicker, multiple times, where we may have taken weeks, months, even longer in past years. Also, developers are very sensitive to friction and delays. That's the enemy. If a developer sees anything that's going to get in the way, I have to use another tool, I'm going to get vulnerability reports, and I'm going to have a lot of false positives from that, whatever it might be. Those things are seen as kind of the enemy because those work against, even though they may be necessary, maybe even seen as a necessary evil, they'll be very much more accepting of security or other activities if it minimizes or reduces friction and delays. Of course, we're always after a shortened, faster, quicker dev cycle. So you can see those two different perspectives. While they're both important, they're both extremely necessary. Sometimes they can kind of be yin and yang, oil and water, whatever it is. So how do we have dev and security work more effectively get together? This idea of DevSecOps. So let's step back and go back to some of the early work. Matter of fact, all the way back to where the term DevSecOps was created, put together. Someone by the name of Shannon Leitz, just fantastic person in the security world. She actually coined this phrase, DevSecOps, and now she's director of DevSecOps at Intuit. And she created the DevSecOps.com, wrote a manifesto, et cetera. Kind of helped to really put this idea of how do we elevate security in a software and applications world. And these are some of the tenets of DevSecOps. So it's kind of good to go back to the starting point and see what was the original idea behind DevSecOps. And then we can talk about some ways of how we can help to achieve that. So things like, and this is presented probably more from a security person's viewpoint, leaning in other words, getting involved, being involved, helping make things happen rather than saying no. Data and security, science instead of fear. Let's use science, let's use data to help make things happen rather than being the kind of the FUD, if you will, fear, uncertainty, and doubt that security vendors probably, or even security professionals might have used in the past to get us to buy their products. Things like open contribution, collaboration, getting involved, that's sort of the shift left idea versus here's my requirements, you have to meet it, tell me when you meet it, and then I'm gonna make you prove it to me. Business drivers, APIs over controls, and others really integrating security into the process and understanding how security is going to be an important factor in the software. Proactive monitoring, threat intelligence, compliance operations, those kind of things, making that part of the DevOps world where security is involved. Maybe they're responsible for some of those things. Maybe it's dev that's responsible for a combination of that. So you can see this idea of DevSecOps. It's really an intersection of a lot of things, but fundamentally what it is a change in how we both think about and we take action on these kinds of activities. And you can see it goes from a compliance, toss it over the wall, I'm going to check that you did it, to how can we make this proactive, how we can make it part of how we work, and how can we make that really fully integrated into our environment. So there's lots of ways, just to give you one kind of data point, we can see this happening within how we create software. There's a great report that comes out every year, the State of the Software Supply Chain report. And I just put this up as an example of how we're looking at software. And it's this really environment of continuous improvement, sort of the quality, the total quality management, back to Deming. How do we continuously make how we do what we do as well as what we do in creating software better? How do we achieve you know, 3.2 times less likely to consider updating a vulnerability in software painful. This is a model of what we see in exemplary development teams when they did this study of development teams. So software folks are very interested in getting better at what they do and also measuring that. And not necessarily what that measurement wasn't necessarily always true, but DevOps has really brought a great focus to that. Also want to mention, we had a prior webinar, Beyond Security did, and we talked about some of the common faux pas, so security mistakes that development teams might make. And you can see a lot of these things sort of happen organically as development teams form. They start to work on software, maybe just a few developers or engineers in the beginning, grows into a larger team. Maybe it's kind of a skunk work project or a small project or something that's even happening in the business unit rather than IT. And they pull together all the things they need to be able to create software. And of course, if you think about that speed and reducing friction and delay, well, if I can get that, I can download this tool to manage my secrets and that tool to automate this and use this cloud service to keep my keys in or secrets there. Pretty soon you get into the sprawl environment. And that's something we talked quite a bit about in that webinar. So we'd definitely recommend that you check that out. I was fortunate enough I guess it's 2 weeks ago now, at the 2020 RSA conference, one of the last in-person conferences I'll probably be going to in a while this year because of the coronavirus. I was fortunate to go to a CISO CIO interchange, which is a group of people that play in kind of senior roles in organizations, very large organizations, where they get together and share and talk about both challenges and success stories. And I was fortunate enough to be at a roundtable where a CISO from a very large food services company, again, here's an example of security being a little more close to the vest, doesn't want to necessarily talk about who this person is, but this CISO, we were talking about how do you get security implemented, not just on one team, but across an entire organization where you may have dev happening in the business unit, in IT, through outside third parties. How do you kind of bring that all together instead of having 20, 50 different ways of doing security across all those teams and architectures? And he had what I thought was a pretty brilliant insight, is find the common denominator, but find the one common denominator that you need early in the dev process. So things like identity architecture, secrets management, privileged access management. Create as a security team, bring key leaders together from both dev and security and create this identity architecture or secrets management or privileged access architecture, some combination of that. Create that together because that's something every project is going to need. And if you can create that in the different cloud environments or private data center, private cloud environment, or across all of those, guess what? Every team, when they start up on the next application, the next project, they reform, that one of the first things they need to do and take care of is already taken care of, and they can reuse work that they've done in the past. Developers love it. And this turned out to be a really great success story for this particular organization. And I thought it took some real leadership and foresight to bring this together to figure out where are some early connection points. By working together, we can help security and dev really become DevSecOps. Now, in this webinar that I mentioned previously, we talked about privileged access management and some of the places that all of these keys, certificates, tokens, where they can show up, and not just the security aspect of it, but also what systems that they can show up, data, cloud services, identity management, devices. It's a big world, a complicated technology stack, and very distributed in the cloud all the way down to devices in the home or devices an end user might be carrying with them in their pocket for their smartphone. So really having something very solid in that early architecture, security architecture, can be a huge benefit. And of course, with Beyond Trust being our sponsor today, it's one of the reasons why we're focusing on that. And then as a security team, understanding not just the security is important, but the life cycle of software and how software is created and the tools that support different pieces of that software process. Everything from source management, how you do continuous integration deployment, development tools, configuration management, containers if you're using, something like Kubernetes, Docker, whatever it might be for containers and container management. That's a world that developers are living in. So as a security professional, now you can start to understand how does the elements of security tools, policies and procedures, things like that, fit in as puzzle pieces to the development process. So it's kind of like, walking a mile in someone else's shoes, but you're walking in, a mile together, maybe understanding the perspective of both teams and how you can make that work as effectively as possible. So let's talk about some ways that this can happen, how you can start from maybe what would be a dev team approach where security is not heavily involved or involved at all. Maybe there's informal team security controls, whatever they've decided, how we're going to manage secrets, what we're going to do for vaults. Is it going to be distributed? Is it going to support cloud environments? Are we going to keep things in cloud services for tokens and secrets, passwords and IDs? And then of course, kind of across what kind of environment. We're dealing with open source. There may be some key management or secret management capabilities across different open source tools, dev tools, dev environments, and of course, places where we store that. And it's probably very likely that if development team is kind of working on their own, without much involvement from others from security, they're likely not fitting into the policies compliance of the organization for how things like credentials and security secrets might be managed for that company. So it's very easy for a development team who's really focused on getting software out the door. And by the way, there's no developer wants to create insecure or unsecure software. I guess not insecure. Yeah, they want to create secure applications, secure code. They don't want their code to be vulnerable and hacked and compromised. But there's also, they've also are under some deadlines, and folks in the business units may not be quite as keen on some of the policies and compliance requirements. They're interested in getting product out the door in customers' hands and generating revenue. So that combination of factors can kind of put the development team a bit out on an island. So one of the things that we can do is, as security professionals, is we can bring a lifecycle management view of how we think about security, how we think about secrets management, how we think about privileged access management and policies around that. Because it's not just when the application gets created, a set of applications, maybe multiple applications that have to work together. It's going to be through the life cycle of that application, but maybe even beyond that, the life cycle of the services that are created as microservices, or the life cycle of devices that are connecting to one or multiple of the cloud and local applications that we're creating. So security professionals, we can think about what are some of the challenges that we're going to have down the road when there's 50, 500, 1,000, 10,000, huge, maybe hundreds of thousands of users on this system. And something that might be a manual process or maybe even automated today on a smaller scale isn't going to scale as we build up this application, and hopefully we're all successful. And of course, it's things like how then does privileged access management work in a way that it can be part of that tool chain as part of that pipeline process for DevOps, because we're going to want to automate that, right? Developers don't want to do manual processes. They're right, though, if there's something that gets in the way, slows them down, they're going to write some automation to make that happen, get it off their plate so they don't have to repeat it again. So we have to have a way of managing not just in a manual process, but integration through APIs and things like that for credential creation and injection, and by credentials. I mean, any form of kind of secrets. Of course, we have to do that for things that may be on-prem, all the way from a developer's laptop that they're creating software on, and the necessary secrets and keys and passwords that they may need to do local testing and development on their device, test environments that may be shared, either within inside the company on-prem or maybe in the cloud or both. And then, of course, production environments where the end application is running. And one of the things that we can also do as security professionals is think about the policy engines that are behind that, the rules, the things that can be automated, that maybe developers are not at a place where they're thinking about some of those questions or issues or audits, and how we can get to a stage where they're going to be happy working with us. So let's now take that kind of one step further. We're going to look at this from the software perspective. One of the things I hear is a term used around often is security is everyone's job. And whether it's security or anything else, it seems like anytime something is everyone's job, it kind of ends up being nobody's job because nobody's really paying attention. There's no ownership for it. Not that we don't think it's important. It's just like, hey, I thought you had that. No, I thought you had that. Or, if it was important, they'd tell me I had to do that. So I think in a development team environment, we're best when we identify who are security champions. I'm going to use that phrase. It could be a lot of different roles. But who is the security champion within the dev team environment? Doesn't have to be a security person from the security organization. Matter of fact, there's some benefits of it being software architecture, lead developer, or one of the dev folks on the team, because they're going to understand the intricacies of the development environment, tools, tool chain processes, and code reviews, and all of the kinds of tools that we can use and integrate that into how we're creating software. They also can then think in working with the security team about the life cycle management of security on the team, the challenges that we have today for security and vulnerabilities and how applications might get compromised. That's going to change over time. We're building containerized applications today, let's say, for cloud native. That could change. We may be doing serverless. We may be using something different for containers, or maybe just a different approach in the future that we have to address the security for. We also need to think about APIs and how the dev automation, and the more that we can make those tools and things friendly to the developers. Of course, back to that friction and delays, high performance is super important to a dev team. So they're going to look at tools that either security teams have brought to them or they're bringing back to security teams as one of the key criteria is going to be, how does it fit in my environment? Can I automate it? And is it going to perform fast? And of course, development teams these days, especially now that all of us are, either today or will be doing remote work, maybe full-time for a while with coronavirus. We have distributed organizations, so we have to be able to operate where the software isn't have to be in the same place that we are to be able to use it. And last but not least, actually, it's one of the most important things that developers consider in a kind of DevSecOps world with security tools is having the technology also come with a community or some kind of developer relations support. Developers are used to picking their own software stack. Matter of fact, most development teams, developers will download a free of something or an open source of something, not just evaluate it, but put it through the paces, maybe start to include it in their development stack, their software stack and process, all the way to production. May live that way for quite a while before they elect to not only buy a product, but choose a product that comes from a company that understands developers. So that's super important to them. Now, fourth piece here is let's look at this from the security perspective in a DevSecOps world, kind of getting to that point. Number one is building trust. And now here I'm talking about trust in relationships with people, right? We don't want the developers to see us as the enemy, the people who are going to say no, right? It's that example that I gave of that CISO going to the development teams and saying, here's where we think would be a great place to start in building this. Let's create this architecture together and we'll work from that. And then they know you're in it not just for yourselves or for what your role is, but also understanding what challenges the development teams are facing. Start to think about security as a shared responsibility, understanding that developers really do want to write secure applications and code. How could we get to push button, what I call push button compliance, where through this automation data that we're collecting, most compliance activities are really about making sure you've got a process and then you have documentation or data to back it up. And the compliance report or audit oftentimes is about collecting that data. Well, can we make that push button? Since we've got all that data, we've got developers here that will automate a good bit of it for us, and we'll all be happy. And that will make the compliance process be shorter. Think about environments that the development teams are both working in and deploying in. Think about security architectures that we can share across teams in the organization. Think also about, from a security perspective, we're going to have some security operations functions that you're going to be monitoring intrusions, looking at attacks, correlating logs from huge numbers of sources with applications, infrastructure, software, services, all kinds of things. Last but not least, I think there's a role for both teams to think about how do you cross-educate, help security engineers understand software architecture a bit more, and vice versa, help security software developers understand how to write secure code. There's lots of resources on the net that you can find just to help each other build up your skills in both environments. Not trying to make one the other, you're trying to make each other stronger by helping each other learn your discipline. So before I turn it over to Jason, we have a poll that we'd like to do. And I'll launch this poll. Hopefully everyone is seeing that. So we're really interested in, are there any upcoming business activities that you'd like to learn more about in 2020? So things like, and please go ahead and start your responses now. I think I've got it set up so you can do that. And there we go, we're getting some responses. So what are kind of some of the things that you're faced with? Got lots of sort of the sprawl problem, giving vendors secure remote access, devices and secure access, managing, auditing, monitoring privileges, rescinding, all of that kind of thing, dynamic security requirements. I could think there's probably even more, some other challenges that we might be faced with. But we're getting a good number of responses here. Like over half our participants have responded. So super easy to do. So please click on what you see as an upcoming business activity. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to share this with everyone. So we kind of see what each other is thinking about as we're doing this. So it looks like we're got a little over 60%. Give a few seconds here if anybody wants to slip in a vote before we close the poll. Going once, going twice, closed. Okay, let's share that result. I'd like to give you some feedback from that poll. So meet dynamic security requirements of DevOps environment. Boy, did we hit that one on the head with the topic for today. So hopefully between what I've shared with you and we'll hear from Jason Jones coming up next, you'll get some really great information that will help you. That's certainly our intent. So with that, that's the conclusion. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And I'm going to turn things over to Jason. So we're going to do a little bit of a handoff. Jason, are you there, man?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mitch. That was great.
Absolutely. Let me give you presenter control here.
Sure.
I just want to make sure I get the right Jason. Okay.
One of the
you should
things
have
that Thank you. One of the
Yeah,
things that I don't even think I really realized, leading up to this was how much focus you put on some of those relationship aspects, and not even there certainly are very specific technical requirements for solving these problems, but oftentimes it starts at two teams talking together and working through what the fundamental requirements are. So
absolutely.
that's yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah, exactly. So again, I'm Jason Jones, product manager at Beyond Trust, and one of the things I wanted to do is just take a couple of minutes and kind of talk about some of the experiences and some of the output that we as a business have gotten from having these conversations with these different teams. It's kind of interesting. A lot of times when we kind of have these discussions or these panels, we kind of need to start with this topic of what is DevOps. But since you guys are kind of self-selecting as a DevOps crowd, Mitch has mentioned a few times PAM or privileged access management. And so in this context, I think it might be a little bit helpful to explain what is PAM, because a lot of times we see dev teams or DevOps teams, they don't really consider themselves part of the PAM market. I think that's a very vendor specific term there to use, but essentially they don't see themselves as part of the purview of a PAM strategy or a PAM initiative within an organization, because they really do have some unique requirements, and as Mitch pointed out, some different goals for what it is they're trying to achieve. So just real quick though, for us as a PAM vendor or as a privileged access management vendor, that definitely has some different definitions. Privileged access management is a broad topic, but we break that down into three primary pillars. The first of which is about privileged password management. So this is kind of considered the traditional how PAM started and what PAM used to mean on its own, where we want to manage the credentials to your critical infrastructure, and then of course monitor access and use of those credentials. But then there's also kind of this endpoint privilege management, where you've got users and their laptops and their desktops, and this strive to remove all admin rights, and so mitigate the risk that could exist from people having too much privilege on their own endpoints, but at the same time needing to balance that, similarly with the DevOps environments, needing to balance that with the productivity of the users themselves. So certainly we want the right constraints in place and controls in place, but also enabling and letting the users still do the tasks and the jobs that they need to do. And the last kind of big pillar is about secure remote access. And this is really more about actually facilitating connectivity to all these things, whether it be third-party vendors needing connect into your environment, or maybe within your environment, you've got these highly secure segmented networks for different reasons, but needing to control and facilitate connectivity into those areas and into those devices, but in a secure and monitored way. So that's really at a high level where we break down kind of the different components of privileged access management, but certainly the industry as a whole breaks it down much more granularly than that. And really our approach here is grouping some of these problem sets and attacking it with adjacent solutions and stuff like that. But this is also where developers and DevOps teams, they're not really clear on the fact that this is absolutely their environments, their workstations, their test environments, production environments are all absolutely part of that privileged access management purview, and part of even where the kind of the broader industry breaks it down into some specific components about DevSecOps pipelines, application development, and all those kind of things. So there really is an intentional piece of privileged access management that focuses on this problem specifically. I think it's helpful for dev teams to kind of think about I'm sure a lot of you have been through some sort of cultural shift in order to get to a DevOps, whether you want to call it a workflow or team or environment, or maybe you're already there, but you know kind of what it took to get to that point. Ultimately, for dev teams and operations teams and even QA teams and everybody involved in the development process, this was a cultural shift. A lot of times you're also shifting to agile, you're also shifting to pushing things to the cloud rather than your own data centers. There's this like overarching concept of shifting security left, and a lot of times that is targeting development of applications. So making sure our applications, the result of what we're building, is secure. But we also want to make sure we understand the impacts to the rest of the business. Like, this is not just a cultural shift for developers, right? You've got all new risk profiles and you've got all new attack services, and you're including new tools in your environment. And this has impacts far beyond the dev teams and the operations teams, certainly the security teams, the identity teams, and definitely impacts kind of reach further than those teams as well. Well, looking at the goals of DevOps, right? As Mitch already pointed out, it's not that security isn't of mind, and it's not that security is kind of like the antithesis of what we're trying to achieve with our DevOps processes, but really what we're trying to do is build the process that allows us to have speed and agility and consistency, which ultimately leads to quality and being able to build things in the right way, but also do it at a decent speed and scale. And so really all that we want to do though is not think of security as something that is either added on after or even wipes the slate clean and changes our process altogether, but kind of very subtly, we just want to, with that shift left mindset, we just want to make sure that we're including security as part of the tools that we choose and as part of the processes and workflows that we're defining. And it's not meant to be this another, yet again, cultural shift, but it is supposed to be a slight tweak in mindset so that we can apply security to our workflows and tools that we're already building. So that was kind of like a view of what are the DevOps goals, but we also need to be mindful of what are the goals of maybe the broader security team or the identity access management teams. And so they may not have the similar goals of speed and scale and agility, but they're more interested in, of course, security and making sure that the build process is right and the environments are all kind of known and there's visibility into who has access to all of these different steps and components and not just thinking about people and what they can access. But now that we're maybe changing our workflow and including new automated processes, needing to know what access those applications have, right? This API key is in and of itself not necessarily a sensitive piece of information, but it gives you access to our entire code base, which ultimately represents the intellectual property of the business. These are things that the security teams need to know who and what has access to all of these things. And as a DevOps kind of organization, it's helpful to have that understanding of what are the goals, what are the broader goals and tasks for these other business units. So what can development teams and DevOps teams do to kind of proactively help this this process of arriving at a solution? And I guess the first one is to be proactive in and of themselves. So don't wait for the security team to come to you and highlight a problem. Certainly, sometimes we're reactive to an audit or a failed audit. But understanding that just building secure applications is only part of the problem, and that we want to understand how our broader risk profile looks like now that we're including all these different tools and environments. And we need to be proactive about finding the right ways to add security into that workflow. Consider including, this is certainly the shift to DevSecOps, is include security as part of the process and not just like a data point along the way, but build a team that includes security so that all the needs of the business, not just the needs of the dev teams, are being considered as you look for solutions to these problems. But also be mindful of not just like picking a tool to solve each and every use case. There may be a better way to have a broader solution that gives you a more concise view and simpler tools across the business, so that maybe you are solving for the security needs as well as the development needs in one solution. Certainly something that will help mitigate some of that application sprawl that can happen when you're looking at all the different steps along the pipeline that you need to solve for. The other thing, though, is to make sure that you're also considering the development needs first, because the security teams are definitely going to be considering what their tasks are and what their goals are first as well. So make sure you have in mind what your workflow needs to look like and find a solution that matches that workflow or has the right integrations with the existing tools in the environment. And kind of think about it from your perspective as well, right? The security team may not be the ones who care what the technology stack of the solution is that you may choose, but you certainly do, because it's an environment that you have to maintain and deploy kind of in a several different ways, whether it be development or test or production. But also that tool needs to still satisfy the needs of the broader business. So make sure that you're not just solving a security problem, but maybe it's also a compliance problem or an audit problem. As kind of this problem set as being defined, and there are solutions that are coming to market, and analysts are kind of developing this definition around what a solved secrets management in a DevOps workflow, or from a PAM perspective, what does PAM look like as it applies to DevOps? And there's some key points that you want to look for when evaluating any solution. You want it to be centralized, so you don't want a solution per tool or a solution per environment. Security teams need a simple way to view this, what's going on in an environment, where's the risk, how are we mitigating it. It needs to be in a centralized place. It needs to be a security tool since we're solving a security problems. Often we see that there are tools that are part of the build pipeline that include some features that seem like security features, but ultimately they're more convenience features, like a nice place to store a secret within your specific tool. But again, it doesn't give you that broader view into the overall workflow. It is often not a security tool, so it kind of gives this false sense of security. And then ultimately it doesn't solve any of the other problems, like creating that rich audit trail or having the right controls around who can store and retrieve that information. Looking at it from a developer's perspective, making sure it does enable you to continue having that agility. We've got to, as Mitch mentioned, we've got to make sure that we're continuing to mitigate and remove that friction as part of our development process. And with any critical piece of your infrastructure, it needs to have just the table stakes of things like fault tolerance, high availability, redundancy, all these things that you're building into your applications. You need to make sure that you're evaluating the tools that you're using in that same context. And then lastly is about auditability. So it is great to solve that security problem, but we also need to make sure we're picking tools that are solving for the audit and the visibility that we need into these secrets and who has access to them. Really, ultimately, this is striking that balance between a security, agility, and compliance, depending on what perspective you're looking at the problem from. And just real quick, at BeyondTrust, this privileged access management is something we've been doing for a very long time. We also feel like we have the right understanding of compliance and audit and the right tools that are developer friendly, API first approach, the right technology stacks. So this is something that we feel like we're very well positioned to understand the needs of both of these different groups, how they are aligned, how they're different, and then making sure that we're offering the right tools for the right problems. So I do want to switch over really quickly and just do a tiny example. I won't even call it a demo, but a tiny example of how you can take an existing tool that you have, and it really doesn't take much. This is a very simple example. Certainly in a production environment, this would look very different. However, it can be this simple to just make a simple tweak. We're not replacing our tools entirely. We're just changing a little bit about the way that we're deploying, and we can add that security that's necessary for securing a secret, for example, that we want to use in production, as well as generating an audit trail that's around it. So here simply I've got an Ansible playbook that is going to spin up a Docker container that is a website showing one web page. So there's no database involved. There's nothing too exciting going on here. But really I've got a variable that is a hard-coded key, right? This is something we of course want to avoid. And a lot of times you don't see, there's lots of ways to mitigate some hard-coded keys, but ultimately we've got this value that we need to provide to our web infrastructure as we deploy it. Maybe it's a database password, maybe it's the certificate used for securing the website itself. But ultimately we've got this secret that we want to provide to our container as it spins up. And so here we just got our web container, and it's going to show a very simple web page. But what we could do instead is have very similar looking playbook, and the only thing that we've really changed is where we're getting this key, right? Everything else is the same. We're using Ansible, we're using Docker containers, we're spinning up the same website. Ultimately, we've just changed how we're getting this key, and instead of hard coding it or instead of using some built-in convenience tool, we're leveraging a centralized secrets management tool to provide Ansible that secret as it needs to spin up the environment. So we'll give it a go here for a little bit of an example. Again, all we've really done is tweaked our playbook slightly and included the right tool in the process. And now we've got a website that has retrieved a secret out of our centralized secret store and provided it to our container for use in however it needs to be used. That was it from a example demo perspective. I can get this back up.
Great. Are we ready for some questions, or you have a little bit more to do there?
No,
Jason?
that's it. That's what I got. I appreciate the time.
All you got. All right, good. Great. Well, let's get to some questions. We've got some really good questions coming in here. So let's start with this one, Jason. I think this is no, let's throw this out there. Maybe both you and I can talk about it. Who do you generally see as the decision maker when it comes to security tools for DevOps team? You want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question, and I guess I'll have to. It ultimately depends on what the driving factor is. So, kind of as I mentioned, we often find ourselves in between the security teams and the development teams, and it's not really our job to mitigate these situations, but it's our job as a vendor to provide tools that really satisfy both of these teams. But
Mhm.
ultimately, it comes down to if it's a failed audit, for example, then it's time for something to be put in place, and you'll find that the security team can kind of mandate that. If though it's really more about the dev team coming to the table with, we know we want to do this, then the security teams are often a little bit more amenable to, you guys decide what the right tool is for you. As long as I'm checking my right compliance checkboxes as a part of that, then absolutely you can make your tool of choice. So it really kind of depends on where in the conversation this has started and what kind of the driving factors are. Mitch, we're not hearing you if you're talking.
It always helps when you turn off
There
mute.
you go.
Uh, there you go. Yeah, just to share some kind of rule of thumbs or just experiences that I've had, it seems like there's two things, at least at a minimum, kind of inflection points where development teams really have to go to the security team. I mean, oftentimes they can work in their own world, work in a cloud environment, do a lot of things on their own. But I know two of the things that they certainly have to go to security for is identity management, SSO, credentials for user account management. Because if you're building an app for an internal application, you usually don't want a separate ID and password, right? They want to tie into the central directory. So that's one connection point or intersection point. Another is getting access to data. Now that may be directly with the security team, or just through the privilege management that they're managing, the rules engine, if you will. And so those are clearly two intersections. Now, who brings the tools to the table? Developers, as I mentioned earlier, they like to select their own stuff. Um, but that's also because developers feel like they know what they want, what they need, and others don't always, or maybe most of the time don't. So it goes back to, I think, the more the security teams, security architect, security engineer can really understand, the application architecture, help collaborate on creating the security architecture for that or multiple applications. Now, okay, we know we're using these open source tools. Those things have credential vaults or safes just to store credentials. How can we automate that and integrate it to a central PAM or a common PAM type of tool? So those are some good places. Does it always have to be security? No. Does it always have to be development? Let's find ways where we can both bring the best ideas and tools to the table. Okay, next question is developers really have to use the tools selected and brought to them by corporate security? Well, that kind of goes a little bit to what I was talking about before. There are some points where they have to get go to someone to get access to SSO, access to data. One of the interesting things is we all say security is extremely important, and it is. Back to that security is everyone's job. Maybe it's no one's. But rarely, unless there's a big breach or pretty significant incident or some ethical violations, rarely does someone get fired for going out and buying another tool, right? So it's a good question. I think, to me, you mentioned earlier, Jason, that I was talking about relationships. Some of it goes back to, do you want a good relationship with the security team? Because you're going to have to work with them at some point, an audit or whenever it is. And it may be convenient just to go off the range even a little farther, but not a bad idea to reach out and see if you can at least collaborate or strike up that first point of collaboration or build on what you've already done up to that point. Jason, any thoughts from your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered it well. The only thing I would add is like depending on your environment, right? If it's a highly regulated environment,
Mm,
things like banking or healthcare or something like that, the short answer could be yes, right? The short answer could be that yeah, you have to use the tools. If you're not providing one, it may be that yes, you do. But certainly all the stuff that you mentioned are driving factors as well.
yeah, great. Next question is for you, and I think I may have said the company name wrong here earlier, Beyond Trust, but what's the difference between BT Password Safe and BT DevOps Secret Safe, the
Yeah,
two
good question.
turnkey
So
products that you
this
have?
is yeah, this is one of those things where password safe has been our kind of traditional privileged access management tool where we're managing credentials and monitoring sessions. And it also has an API. And so this DevOps conversation is one that we've been having for a while and solving for, retrieving secrets in kind of a secure manner and storing them centrally is something that we've been doing for a while. But more recently, we released DevOps Secret Safe, which is a more targeted tool. It's understanding the developer's needs. It's understanding DevOps teams and their technology stack and their workflows and the types of integrations that they need. And it's building a solution that is specific to their environment and their needs while still understanding. It's essentially trying to solve for all the key things that the analysts and the industry are pointing out is very important. It's not just about monitoring users and their access, but it's treating applications as kind of first-class citizens. It's auditing the access that they have, defining it very granularly. So it's essentially understanding that there is a broader and kind of overlapping privileged access management need here, but that the use cases and the environments and the types of systems that are involved here can look very different and may need a very specific solution.
Mhm. Very good. You know what? We have, I think, time for maybe one more question. I think this is another really good one for you if you take a crack at it. What do you recommend for injecting a password in a config or properties file? For example, the SQL connection, an important one, oftentimes gets a shared user account, sometimes is a sort of faux pas that people do. Once injected, what do you recommend to encrypt as you don't want unencrypted passwords in the config on the server?
Yeah, so this is one of those you get into kind of these testy waters about telling people how to use the tools, right? And what certainly I'm not an expert on the best development practices as opposed because certainly there's all sorts of considerations here about what did you use to build that environment, what did you use to stand up the infrastructure. So it could look differently if you're using Ansible or Jenkins or if you're using your homegrown scripts to deploy things. Kind of ultimately the to try to answer the question as best I can, doing a real-time lookup of that credential. So not having it as part of your static configuration, but let it be part of the deployment and use those tools and APIs at runtime or as close to runtime as you can so that you don't have these static credentials along the way or kind of worst case checked into source code and let it be part of how the how the environment is being stood up as opposed to how the application is being developed.
One thing I would add to also what you said, Jason, is a config file for some piece of software may allow you to use just in the clear user ID and password. I'll bet though there are other mechanisms that you can use that are more secure, encrypted password, a security token, lots of tying into a credential management system, something identity management system like that. So. Um, Another is if you have to put in clear text ID and password, set it up so that those things get rotated very frequently. So while that may work for a short period of time, that key, that user ID, that password, whatever, may be being changed on a high frequency basis to keep that secure. So, but there most likely there's some other alternative other than a clear text password and user ID. Well, we're really up against the end of our time. I'm going to thank you, Jason, for a great talk and presentation. It's been
Yeah, you too.
fantastic
Thank you.
to be a part of this. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you on the webinar today. And of course, thank you, our listeners, for the great questions, participating with us as well. I want to announce our 3 Amazon gift card winners. They are G. Weestrand, Janet L., and W. Boyce. So the folks at DevOps.com will be getting a hold of you about how to get those gift cards. So it's been a great pleasure to be with you today. And I want to thank Jason Jones, Senior Product Manager from Beyond Trust, and as well as Beyond Trust for hosting today's webinar. It's been a great having you part of the audience as well. I mean, this is an hour of your time and we know it's super valuable, and it's an honor that you've spent it with us. So have a great day and be careful out there.